I remember the day Allison first brought up the idea of an open marriage like it was etched into my mind with acid. We were sitting at our dining table, the same place we'd spent so many mornings sipping coffee and nights chatting about our dreams. Only this time, the conversation felt electric. Her eyes darted around as though she was searching for an exit, even while she tried to sound confident about her request. It was a Tuesday, if I recall correctly, and we were recovering from a minor argument about me forgetting to pick up our daughter's new ballet shoes. I thought we'd settle that spat quickly enough. Never did I imagine Allison would throw a metaphorical bomb into our marriage, one that would lead us down a path so twisted, I still sometimes question what was real and what wasn't. When she first proposed an open marriage, I stared at her for a good 30 seconds, trying to parse her exact words. She stuttered something about spicing up our love life and exploring new experiences. I didn't know how to respond because everything in me screamed that this was a terrible idea, that it could only end in heartbreak. But I had once sworn to consider her feelings, to be open-minded, to trust that her intentions were anchored in love. Foolishly, I consented, not because I truly wanted to, but because fear of losing her outweighed my instincts. She seemed so sure, or maybe just desperate to shift something in her life. In hindsight, I suspect she'd already set her sights on someone else. Our daughter, Justine, was only 8 at the time. She was a curious, imaginative child who would draw pictures of unicorns and princesses and talk with big eyes about all the magical stories she conjured in her head. Despite the tensions lurking beneath our polished suburban exterior, I always believed that Allison and I were raising Justine to value honesty and empathy. What a joke that turned out to be. Within a few months of our open marriage experiment, Allison confessed that she'd begun texting her ex-boyfriend, Aaron. He was one of those guys who'd always had a lingering presence, the kind you might call a shadow from the past. I played it cool at first, swallowing my jealousy along with half a bottle of whiskey, because I was determined not to be the controlling husband. If open marriage was supposed to be about freedom and trust, I didn't want to sabotage it by acting like a possessive fool. But deep inside, every time she dressed up for her nights out, I felt something turn sour in my gut. There were times when she would stay out so late that I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it might collapse on me. My mind raced with images of Allison and Aaron, images that, no matter how hard I tried, refused to be banished. Soon, our home became a hotel, a place where she would pop in to smile at Justine, prepare a quick meal, then step out with an excited wave. I was left as the babysitter who pretended not to notice how my wife's affections were drifting far from me. The worst part was the creeping sensation that she was enjoying the thrill of hurting me. She thought I didn't see her triumphant smirk whenever she got a text from Aaron. She believed I was blind to those fleeting moments when she would check my reaction, hoping I'd be seething with envy. Perhaps she wanted a reaction, a fight, anything to let her know she still mattered to me. But by then, I felt too numb to give her that satisfaction. I decided I would quietly endure, at least until I could figure out the right move. Eventually, I recognized that open marriage was merely a stepping stone to the kind of life Allison truly wanted, one where she could indulge her jealous streak while blaming me for not meeting her expectations. Because ironically, she was jealous even as she cheated. She wanted to watch me squirm, to watch me chase after other women, possibly so she could pit herself against them and measure her worth. It was twisted psychology at its finest. Yet for a while, I didn't get involved with anyone else. My energy was consumed by resentment and confusion. I felt as though I was floating through life, disconnected from everything I once believed in. But life can be funny. One evening, while grabbing a cup of coffee at a small shop outside my office, I met Sarah. She was a new assistant manager there, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and a warm smile that crinkled her eyes. It was an innocent meeting, one of those fleeting moments that normally dissolve into the background of daily routine. But there was a kindness to her that made me let my guard down for the first time in months. I found myself going back to that coffee shop more often, eventually chatting with Sarah about everything from childhood memories to silly stories about Justine's attempts at dancing in the living room. It felt refreshing. No pressure, no mind games, no hidden agenda. 3 weeks into my friendly banter with Sarah, something shifted in me. I realized I was actually allowed to date in an open marriage. Allison had insisted on this arrangement, presumably for her own benefit. So I took the plunge and told Sarah that my marriage was complicated and that my wife and I had, in theory, agreed to see other people. Sarah hesitated, initially uncomfortable with the notion, but I think she sensed the sincerity in my eyes. She could see the exhaustion in my face, the heartbreak I tried so hard to hide. After a few more conversations, we decided to meet for dinner, and that was the beginning of something genuine in my life, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Allison did not respond well when she discovered I was dating Sarah. She was furious, which struck me as the height of hypocrisy. Here she was, spending nights with her ex, parading it in front of me, but at the slightest hint that I was seeing another woman, she hurled insults at me as though I were the worst adulterer on the planet. Her jealousy ramped up to the point that she started digging through my phone, demanding that I end it. Suddenly, the open marriage was a problem, a bad idea that had gone too far. But the damage had already been done, and for the first time in over a year, I felt something other than despair. I felt defiance. I told Allison that if she wanted to keep seeing Aaron, that was her choice, but she had no right to impose a double standard on me. Of course, she continued her clandestine meetups with Aaron. She became more frantic, trying to maintain a stranglehold on me while also indulging her fling with her ex. Meanwhile, Sarah and I grew closer. She was everything Allison once was but had lost: empathetic, patient, and genuinely interested in me. I confided in Sarah about my frustrations, about how I wanted to shield Justine from the toxicity that was brewing at home. Sarah encouraged me to talk to a lawyer, to consider my options. I wrestled with guilt, uncertain whether I was betraying my family or simply saving myself from a marriage already gone to ruin. The turning point came the night Justine heard Allison and me arguing. I discovered that Allison had told Justine a twisted version of events, claiming I was some kind of unfaithful father who didn't care about family. She'd told Justine that my girlfriend was going to take me away from her, that I didn't love her as much because I was preoccupied with a stranger. I saw red. The vicious manipulation of our daughter crossed a line so blatant that I couldn't remain silent. I confronted Allison in the living room, my voice trembling with rage as I demanded she never lie to our daughter about me again. She responded with a mocking laugh, as though everything I said was a joke. Justine cowered behind the stairway, tears in her eyes. At that moment, I realized I was done. I started packing my bags. I wasn't going to stay in a house where my own wife was poisoning my child's mind against me. Allison acted shocked, as though she thought I'd never actually leave. She cried, threatened to call the police, threatened to ruin my reputation, threatened to tell Justine all sorts of ugly lies if I walked out the door. My hands were shaking, but I refused to back down. I calmly explained that if she didn't stop, I would go for full custody. I think she knew that I had documented enough of her behavior, her drunken texts, her erratic late nights, her refusal to prioritize Justine's well-being. She knew I had the upper hand. Stunned, she finally fell silent, and I walked out. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was cramped, with just enough room for a single bed, a small sofa, and a desk where I could work. But it felt like my sanctuary. I filed for separation the next week, not yet certain about divorce, but definitely unwilling to continue living a lie. Sarah helped me furnish the place, brought me home-cooked meals on nights when I was feeling particularly alone. She listened patiently while I sorted through my feelings, always giving me space when I needed it. She never tried to push me into a rebound relationship. She simply let our connection evolve at its own pace. In the weeks that followed, Allison ramped up her obsession. She would park her car across the street from my apartment, sitting there for hours, presumably spying on my comings and goings. More than once, I caught sight of her figure lurking around the corner when Sarah would come over. It was a bizarre and chilling sight. This was the same woman who had insisted on an open marriage, who had made my life miserable with her double standards, and who was still actively seeing her ex as far as I knew. Yet she refused to let me go. In her mind, she owned me, and any attempt on my part to break free was a betrayal that required punishment. Justine would visit me on weekends, and I did my best to create a normal life for us amid the chaos. We went to the park, we baked cookies, we watched silly comedy movies together. She was always so happy to see me, though sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of sadness in her eyes, as if she didn't quite understand why her mother and father couldn't live under the same roof anymore. I assured her that none of it was her fault, that we both loved her more than anything in this world. Deep down, I still harbored fury for how Allison had lied to her, but I tried to keep my composure. I didn't want Justine's childhood memories scarred by her parents' vendetta. Allison began calling me in the middle of the night, breathing heavily into the phone without saying a word. It was textbook stalking behavior, and it sent chills down my spine. One evening, she even confronted Sarah in the parking lot of the coffee shop. I wasn't there, but Sarah told me later how Allison had screamed at her, calling her a homewrecker and a whore, all while the baristas and a handful of customers looked on. Sarah kept her cool, walked away, and reported the incident to the police. I filed a complaint as well, but it was a challenge to prove stalking since Allison was always sneaky enough to avoid direct confrontation when I was around. Then came the night I discovered that Allison had called Justine in tears, telling her that I was abandoning them. The phone call left Justine shaken, and she demanded to know why I was making Mommy so sad. It was as though Allison had found her lever of control again. She used Justine's innocence as a weapon. I seethed with anger, but I also felt a twinge of pity. Allison was unraveling. Whatever insecurities had led her to want an open marriage in the first place were now devouring her from the inside, feeding into this monstrous obsession. I tried to be civil. I suggested we see a mediator to arrange a fair custody plan, to talk about the details of our separation without traumatizing our daughter. Allison acted receptive for about 2 hours. Then, out of nowhere, she texted me that she wanted to close the marriage. She wanted to stop seeing Aaron and begged me to come back to her so we could heal as a family. I was floored by the audacity. Here was the woman who had insisted on an open marriage, who had lied to our daughter about my faithfulness, who had stalked me when I moved on, who had tried to sabotage any happiness I found outside of her twisted games. And now she acted as though we could press a button and reset the entire fiasco. She pleaded, apologized profusely, and promised she would never betray me again. Part of me almost laughed at the absurdity. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that there would be no going back. I had finally grown into a new sense of self-respect, and I refused to let her trample it. The open marriage was a Pandora's box she had chosen to open, and after all her manipulations, betrayal, and emotional blackmail, I felt no inclination to forgive. A simmering anger replaced the ache in my chest. While I didn't want to fight a petty war, I also couldn't let her trample me. So I began setting up the final steps. I filed for divorce. I hired a reputable lawyer who was well-versed in dealing with narcissistic behaviors. I meticulously collected evidence of her stalking, her threats, her mental games. This was my line in the sand. The day of the custody hearing, Allison sat across from me in a crisp blouse, her hair pulled back, trying to look like the embodiment of a perfect mother. Her eyes locked onto mine with a strange mixture of desperation and hatred. In front of the judge, she played the victim, sobbing about how I had neglected her emotional needs and turned her into a paranoid wreck. She tried to paint me as a man who'd forced her into an open marriage just to humiliate her. My lawyer calmly presented the counter evidence. Text messages from Allison explicitly laying out the rules of our open arrangement, screenshots of her flaunting her affair with Aaron, testimony from Sarah about the threats and harassment. Allison's theatrics unraveled under the weight of truth. When the judge granted me primary custody of Justine, based on the evidence that I was the more stable parent, Allison let out a scream that echoed through the courtroom. She lunged from her seat, pointing a shaking finger at me, howling that I had ruined her life. The bailiff had to restrain her. It was a surreal moment, one that hammered home the magnitude of her unraveling. And in that moment, something inside me felt darkly triumphant. Revenge wasn't sweet in the conventional sense. It was the grim satisfaction of knowing I had not allowed her to break me completely, that I had stood my ground and protected my daughter from further harm. When we walked out of the courthouse, I cradled Justine's hand in mine and explained that for now, she would be living primarily with me. Allison would have visitation rights, assuming she could show she was in a fit state to care for Justine during those visits. It was a measured arrangement, not one I reveled in, but one I believed was best for my child. I looked down at Justine, and for a moment, I felt her grip tighten. I could sense her fear, her confusion, and her longing to have both parents as they once were. That dream was gone, and it hurt. But she was strong, stronger than Allison gave her credit for. Over the next few weeks, Allison tried every trick to regain some semblance of control. She left voicemails ranging from sobbing pleas for forgiveness to hateful rants that threatened to take me down if I didn't come back to her. She cornered me once in the grocery store, hissing that she couldn't believe how cold I was for not giving her another chance. I looked her dead in the eye and told her the old me would have wanted to fix things, to get back what we lost. But too much had happened, and I refused to let her manipulate me or our daughter any longer. Her expression shifted then, morphing into something like shock mixed with pure malice. And in that moment, I felt my self-respect crystallize into something unbreakable. Sarah was a constant pillar of support. She never once tried to replace Allison in Justine's life, but she made it clear she would always be there for both of us. My father used to say that you know someone is right for you when they treat your child with the same love and care they give you. Sarah exemplified that. Over time, she and Justine built a gentle bond. They baked together, read books together, and sometimes collaborated on little art projects that Justine proudly displayed on my fridge. Meanwhile, Aaron dropped out of Allison's life once he realized there was too much drama. According to mutual acquaintances, he was never interested in dealing with a custody battle or a possibly volatile ex-wife. In a strange twist, it seemed Allison was left with nothing. No stable relationship, limited custody of her daughter, and a shredded reputation among those who had observed her meltdown. At times, I almost pitied her, but that pity never extended to forgiveness. My scars ran too deep for that. The next months tested my patience. Allison routinely violated boundaries, bombarding my phone with messages about how she had changed, about how open marriage was a huge mistake. She even tried to spin the story that Aaron had coerced her. It was obvious nonsense. My lawyer warned me to be cautious, as she might be preparing to pull another stunt in court to reverse custody. I meticulously saved every text, every voicemail, anticipating that I would need them to protect Justine. One night, Allison showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. Sarah was there, helping me tidy up after dinner. I found Allison standing in the hallway, breathing heavily, her eyes glassy. She looked disheveled, like she'd been crying for hours. She mumbled about wanting to talk to me, to fix our marriage. I told her that we had nothing left to fix. She raised her voice, shouting that I owed her another chance, that I was throwing away years of our life together. Sarah gently walked to the bedroom to give us privacy, but Allison followed her, screaming that she was a thief, a liar, that she had stolen me away. Something snapped in me then. I stepped between them, my voice shaking with fury, and told Allison to leave before I called the police. Allison started to sob, her entire body trembling as she sank to her knees in the hallway. It was a disturbing scene, and part of me felt a pang of compassion, but I couldn't let that overshadow the fact that she was harassing us. I picked up my phone, ready to dial 911, when she finally stood up and left. That night, I locked the door and sank onto the couch, feeling exhaustion roll over me in waves. Sarah rested a hand on my shoulder, her expression a mix of concern and relief that it hadn't escalated further. After that incident, my lawyer sent Allison a formal cease and desist letter, warning her against further harassment. She quieted down for a few weeks, though I heard from a mutual friend that she was ranting online, telling half-truths to garner sympathy. The typical narrative was that I had broken her heart, that I had forced an open marriage on her, that she was a victim who just wanted her family intact. People who knew better generally kept their distance or quietly supported me. I didn't bother publicly correcting every lie. I was focused on preserving my sanity and giving Justine the stability she deserved. Justine adjusted reasonably well, though she missed her mother. I allowed phone calls between them, as per our agreement, and sometimes I saw glimpses of the loving Allison I'd once known when she spoke gently to our daughter. But I could never forget what she did, and I made it clear that if she dared lie to Justine again or tried to sabotage our bond, I would take legal measures to restrict her access. No more half measures. Despite all the chaos, Sarah and I moved forward in our relationship. We took things slow, mindful of Justine's emotional state. We avoided overt public displays of affection around her, wanting to demonstrate respect for the complexities of the situation. But over time, Justine warmed up to the idea that her father had someone who genuinely cared for him. One night, Justine even said she was happy to see me smile again. It was like a weight lifted from my chest to hear those words. Months turned into a year. The divorce was finalized, custody solidified. Allison tried unsuccessfully to reduce my custody rights by claiming I was emotionally abusive, but her accusations fell flat without evidence. The judge was less than impressed with her theatrics. She was granted supervised visits for a period, and eventually, she began to show some signs of wanting to improve herself. I heard through the grapevine that she was attending therapy. Good for her, I thought. She needed it. It's ironic how the most unpredictable endings sometimes lie in quiet revelations. About a year after the divorce, I was called by Allison's therapist, who wanted to see if I'd be open to a joint session to help facilitate better communication for Justine's sake. I was hesitant. Everything in my soul screamed that I owed her nothing, but the therapist argued that a single session might help me and Allison find a healthier way to co-parent. After some thought, I agreed to go, determined to keep the conversation focused on Justine's well-being. On the day of the session, I walked into that office with my shoulders tense, expecting another manipulative meltdown. Allison was seated on a couch, wringing her hands. She looked thinner, paler, as though life had drained out of her. The therapist began by talking about how Allison had acknowledged her mistakes, how she wanted to make amends and be a better mother. I listened quietly, my jaw clenched. Then Allison turned to me, tears in her eyes, and delivered a halting apology, one that, for the first time, sounded unforced. She confessed that her insecurities had driven her into a spiral of jealousy and self-sabotage, that she had never really wanted an open marriage but had sought it out of fear that I would leave her eventually. She believed if she got the upper hand by sleeping with Aaron, she would feel powerful. Yet, it had all backfired. I could see the therapist looking at me, expecting me to reciprocate with some gentle words of reconciliation. But I had none to give. I thanked Allison for her honesty, affirmed that I hoped she would continue to heal and become a stable mother for Justine, but I also made it clear I could not forgive her. The damage was done, the trust irreparably shattered. There was no resurrecting a marriage from that rubble. I watched Allison's face crumble, her tears dripping onto the cushion beneath her. In a different life, I might have offered comfort. But not now, not after everything. That was the last time I saw her in a therapeutic setting. She continued with her sessions and gradually managed to keep her actions less erratic. Our co-parenting relationship improved slightly, though it remained strained. I let her have unsupervised visits once she demonstrated consistent stability over several months. Justine deserved a mother who wouldn't unravel at the first sign of conflict. The day I gave that permission, Allison thanked me softly, but I simply nodded, my expression impassive. Sometimes, even now, I dream about the early days of our marriage, the laughter, the shared plans for the future, the silly traditions that only made sense to us. And each time I wake, I remind myself that the woman in those dreams no longer exists. She was replaced by someone I can barely recognize. Occasionally, I'll catch sight of Allison at a school function or a dance recital, and we'll exchange civil nods. But underneath that thin veneer of politeness is the knowledge that we remain adversaries on some level, forced by circumstance to coexist for our daughter's sake. Forgiveness? It never arrived, and I doubt it ever will. Betrayal of that magnitude isn't something I can simply dismiss, but vengeance took its own course. In stripping me of my illusions, Allison lost everything she once had: my trust, our marriage, the right to shape Justine's upbringing unopposed. In the end, I found a quiet sense of closure. The unpredictability of it all turned out to be that I never discovered some grand redemption, no cinematic reconciliation. Life simply continued, with me rebuilding piece by piece. Sarah and I eventually moved to a slightly larger apartment, one with a second bedroom for Justine and more space to breathe. We created our own traditions, our own sense of family. My daughter is now old enough to see that sometimes people make catastrophic choices that can't always be forgiven or forgotten. But she also sees that life can go on, that new bonds can form out of the wreckage of old ones. Perhaps the real unpredictability lies in how something as twisted as an open marriage demanded out of jealousy could lead to a place of personal strength for me. I lost the illusions that had once tethered me to a toxic dynamic, discovering that my self-respect was worth more than clinging to a person who found pleasure in my pain. For all the heartbreak, the final outcome was a sort of liberation, from her manipulations, from my own fear of being alone, and from the naive belief that love means accepting anything for the sake of keeping the family intact. I don't fool myself into thinking the future will be easy. Allison remains a volatile presence in our lives, one who might lash out whenever she feels threatened or lonely, but that no longer keeps me awake at night. I have the law on my side, and I've taken precautions. More importantly, I've tapped into a reservoir of resilience I never knew existed. I stand firm in the knowledge that if Allison tries to sabotage me or my daughter again, I won't hesitate to fight back. Legally, emotionally, whatever it takes. Because in my world now, there's no tolerance for betrayal. There's only the unyielding resolve to protect the life and happiness I've painstakingly rebuilt. These days, I find satisfaction in simple moments. Sharing a quiet dinner with Sarah and Justine, laughing at the silliest jokes, or watching my daughter master a new dance routine. I reflect on the years I spent tiptoeing around Allison's insecurities and realize how small my world had become. Now that I'm free, there's an entire horizon of possibilities. I won't say I'm entirely grateful for the pain. That kind of suffering leaves lasting scars. But in a strange way, it taught me exactly what I refuse to tolerate ever again. Allison's final attempt to close the marriage came too late. She unleashed havoc and uncovered the worst parts of herself. Now, she's left with the consequences of that choice, alone in a reality she shaped with her own hands. I've moved on, forging a path that she has no claim to. The day I closed that door, I locked it tight, ensuring it stayed shut, never to be opened again. There is no forgiveness, only a steely determination to live the life she once denied me, and a firm resolve that no one, no matter how deeply entwined in my past, will ever again have the power to destroy my peace.